Confess. Confess. Confess.
Welcome back to my channel. Today we are deep diving into ethics, why it matters, why we have the ethical standards in place that we do, and how we got here. Let's begin by looking at terminology relevant to this whole ethics discussion. Normally in intro psych, I would cover this in the second chapter, research method stuff, because this is a huge part of experiments. Being able to run the experiment ethically for the safety of the participants and to make sure that we get good data out of it. Let's begin the terminology with informed consent. Informed consent is the agreement between participant and experimenters. There are many requirements to have informed consent. You can't just say, you're doing an experiment and have them sign off on it. It doesn't fly that way. The requirements for informed consent are the following. The paper that participants are signing needs to be understandable by them in plain English. You can't load the document full of jargon and expect participants, especially if we're talking about the average participant pool for a lot of psychology, we're talking intro psych undergrads, maybe second year undergrads. You can't expect them to know the jargon of all of these different fields that they might be exposed to. Or if you're doing experiments not on that population, but out in the community, on kids, on older adults, you need to have language that these people can understand. You also have to fully document the risks associated with this experiment. For most of the research I did, this was sitting at a computer, so you might bang your hand on the desk. Over a long enough period of time, you might develop carpal tunnel, you might get a paper cut. These are the risks that we're talking about at this level of experiment. For some experiments, it might be something more, I don't want to say invasive just yet, but if you're doing an EEG experiment, you're going to have a net stuck on your head with a bunch of electrodes. And if you happen to be allergic to one of the ingredients used to get the electrode to make good contact with your skin, it'd be good to know that before you sign up and agree to do this experiment. An example that I ran into a bunch was with the driving simulator research. It was part of a car that was on like an amusement park ride sort of hydraulics, and so it made people motion sick on a regular basis. Programming the experiments in there, I had to take Dramamine in order to be able to do it without curling up my lunch. It was really important for participants to know that there is a risk that they could get motion sick from this, and it might last all day. It didn't tend to last beyond that, but this is something that they need to know going into the experiment to be able to decide if this is something that they actually want to do. We'll talk about why we care about this, especially on things where they might get a paper cut, and that's the extent of the damage that could happen. But yeah, we have reasons for wanting full documentation here. Another thing is they need to be informed of the nature of research. Participants coming in may not be fully aware of their rights as a participant. Among these, this includes their right to safety, and if we're going to possibly jeopardize their safety, they absolutely need to know how and why. Like I said with the driving simulator, we were somewhat jeopardizing their health for the day and that they could get motion sick. Another portion of being informed is their right to quit. At any point, a participant has the right to say, I'm done, I'm withdrawing, I can't do this anymore. This was something we really hammered home with the driving simulator research because people would get sick. After a point, you could tell when somebody was starting to feel sick before they really knew. Like they would start breathing funny, they'd be swallowing a lot, they'd look not good. And I don't know how many participants we sent home early because you're gonna not be feeling good here soon. Just stop. It's okay. You've earned your research credit. Go home. We don't need the data that badly to risk, you feeling sick and also having to clean up the driving simulator because somebody blew chunks all over it. Another aspect of this is there needs to be no harmful consequences for the participant stopping. This is definitely an issue in college. Participants in the undergraduate pool typically are recruited in exchange for course credit, maybe extra credit, and they can't be penalized if they withdraw. You can't reduce their grade because they withdrew from an experiment. It's on them. It's their choice. It's their right as an autonomous human being. They're allowed to stop whenever they choose, and they cannot be penalized for it. If participation is mandatory for a course, at the place I did my graduate studies, it was mandatory for the intro psych and eventually the experimental method students to participate. There had to be an alternative available. The alternative, and I really questioned the ethics on this, but I wasn't in charge. The alternative was to write an essay, I think it was like 2 or 3 pages, on a paper of their choosing for each experiment they didn't want to do or participate in. I think on average, they were doing 8 to 10 experiments per semester. So for an intro psych student, that means if they don't want to participate in experiments, they need to write 10 3-page essays by the end of the semester. I mean, they were trying to make it unappealing to encourage students to do research because it was kind of a pain. You had to sign up, you had to show up. The going rate was 1 experiment credit per hour. Although if they did like a half-hour one for me, some of mine were that short, I'd still give them credit for an hour because they came out, took time out of their day, and sometimes things went long, whatever. The driving simulator experiments were usually like a 2 or 3 hour thing, so they would get 2 or 3 credits. But those credits were null and void if they didn't show up to all 3 sessions. So there was a little bit of a gamble there for them. Tying into the last one with questionable ethics I might have seen in graduate school, it needs to not be coercive getting participants to participate in your experiments. So like I said, having an alternative that was a lot more work than just showing up to the experiment kind of feels like coercion to me. Another aspect of this is once they're participating, you can't twist their arm into continuing something that they don't want to do. If somebody is done, that's it. Don't guilt them. Don't question their judgment, question their reasons. They are done. You need to respect that. Finally, deception should only be used when no alternatives are available. What does this mean? In certain circumstances, we were in essence allowed to lie to participants. A good chunk of my research was on implicit learning, and I'll talk about that in another video, but with implicit learning, you can sometimes impact the results if people know that they're going to be learning this information that way. In the informed consent, we told them the surface level information about the task that they were going to do, but we didn't tell them there was going to be repeating information here. We held some information back. And because there was no other way to get at the sorts of effects that we were looking for, we were allowed to do so. There is a cost benefit here. Us holding back information about the exact nature underlying the information they were being presented is a little itty-bitty lie compared to telling somebody that they aren't receiving a cancer treatment. That's a bit more of a huge lie and a huge problem, and it would be incredibly surprising if an experiment where treatment was withheld from participants and they weren't told that was a possibility. There's no way that would get past an IRB today. There's no way. So IRB, throwing jargon at you already. An IRB is the Institutional Review Board. It can also be called the Ethical Review Board, other names, but these are things at places to clear ethics of experiments going through an institution, and I'll talk more about that later. Deception must never be about significant aspects of the experiment. If pain is involved, people need to be told. If discomfort is involved, people need to be told. Like with the driving simulator stuff, we told them they could get motion sick. That was something that we didn't hide. That would be unethical. The last aspect of the deception criteria here is that the deception needs to be revealed as soon as possible. At the end of our implicit learning experiments, we told participants, hey, there was this thing, you didn't realize you were learning it, we were interested in it, and we're sorry we had to lie to you, but it was the only way to get at this. P.S. Please don't tell your friends. It was a huge issue. Students leaving the informed consent forms and debriefing forms just in the hallway on the ground, and other people picking them up, becoming wise to the experiment. It got to the point where I was telling students, this debriefing form that we gave them after the experiment was done, this is your receipt that you completed the experiment. If something happens with the computer system that automates credit for this, you have this receipt that you finished it. Keep it. And even that wasn't enough. It got to the point where I was offering students, do you want this? Do you not want this? If you don't want this, I'll just take it back. I don't need it floating around the halls. More terminology to know is one I've already used. One important aspect of informed consent is the debriefing. This is when participants are told that this is the thing they did, this is why they did it, this is why their contribution was important, and it's an important part of the process, especially for students who are doing this as part of like intro psych or experimental methods. We're doing this in part so that they can see what normal current psychological research looks like. And part of that process is learning about what the current research is. Another aspect of debriefing is getting feedback from the participant. I had some experiments where the feedback was, this is way too hard. That's really important to hear from participants because I run myself through it. Everything seems fine. Participant sits down to do it. Either the directions aren't clear or the task is too hard or whatever, and we're not getting at the nature of whatever task we're asking for here. Another terminology piece to know is what's known as a confederate. Confederates are people who appear to be in the experiment but are actually in on it. Confederates are used a lot of times in like social experiments where we're trying to establish group dynamics, and the easiest way to do that is to have some friends, fellow grad students, faculty, whatever, sitting in on the group, acting like they're also participants, and seeing what the actual experiment participant does, given this group dynamic that they're being forced into and they don't even know. Another nuance detail here is I keep using the term participant. I'm doing this because this is the American Psychological Association standard for referring to people who voluntarily participate in experiments. Frequently, in the past, they were called subjects, and by some people in the field, such as Roediger, who's a huge name in memory research, they use the term subject. This comes down to a debate in what we call them, how much acknowledgement people get, what is a more ethical term to call people. So on the participant side, which again is the industry standard side, they're called participants because we are acknowledging that this research would not happen without their contribution. They're important and they are participating. They're not just sitting there with needles stuck into their head like some perception research macaques. These participants are actively doing something and we need them to do that. If they just sat there and mindlessly did it, we wouldn't get good data and have good experiments out of it. On the other hand, subjects is what they used to be called, and it indicates more of this view that they're here and they're being subjected to the experiment. And I mean, some students certainly feel that way. They don't necessarily want to be there participating happily. They're being sort of forced to do this kind of against their will. If they're doing this for course credit, again, I mentioned the sort of gray area there with coercion and good alternatives. So, yeah. But for the purposes of this, we're going to be using the term participant, even though it is a bit wordier to say. Another huge part of informed consent is that people's data is confidential. No ifs, ands, or buts. their data needs to not be associated or associatable to them. This is something that seems relatively minor for things like my experiments, where we're just testing their ability to learn random information. But for medical studies, think about how huge an issue this could be. If somebody participates in an experiment and they find out that they've got some weird genetic variant that increases their likelihood of something, if that gets out, their insurance might find out, and suddenly they don't have benefits anymore. I mean, this sort of got better under the ACA, but then we're not going to talk politics. Confidentiality is absolutely important. There's many different things you can do to protect people's confidentiality when they participate in experiments. And if I do experimental methods section proper, I'll talk about ways that I did it in my lab and also just suggestions for how to go about doing this. Confidentiality can sometimes be a bit difficult to protect for people. The place I went to grad school was predominantly white. There were Black students, but it was predominantly white. So if somebody was gathering information about age, race, gender, this experiment came from the intro psych pool where there were 10 Black students and 990 white students. It's hard to guarantee the confidentiality of those 10 Black students when they're participating. It is hard to pin down exactly which Black student was in which experiment, but it is possible, given enough time and effort, that somebody could figure out the identity of the Black student in this one experiment. Another issue with this is if you're a non-traditional student, you are going to be an outlier for age. Most of the intro psych students we had were between 17 and maybe 20. And if somebody's a returning student, they're in their 30s. When we're reporting the demographic information, we have mean age, low 20s, and then we have to note that outlier. Suddenly, that person's data isn't quite as confidential as we might like. So yeah, it's just something to keep in mind for confidentiality. The second portion of this video, I'm going to walk you through the history, at least at the intro psych level, of ethics and how we ended up where we are today with ethical review boards and the standards that we have for ethical treatment of participants. The first experiment I'm going to talk about is the Tuskeegee syphilis experiment that was conducted in Alabama in the years 1932 to 1972. In this experiment, the participants, or in this case might be better to say subjects, were poor Black men some of which had syphilis. These men were told that they would receive free health insurance for participating in these experiments and also receive a free burial if and when they die. So this experiment went on for 40 years, so that isn't necessarily a bad benefit to offer your subjects. These men thought that they were receiving treatment for what was known as bad blood. This was a local term that included things like syphilis, anemia, general fatigue, just things floating around your blood that made you sick. Because these were poor Black men in Alabama, they didn't have the highest level of education, so their medical understanding was probably somewhat limited, and also they trusted their doctors. Huge mistake in this case. In reality, the point of this experiment was to see the time course and effects of syphilis. So these men thought they were receiving treatment, and they weren't. The doctors wanted to see what happens as syphilis progresses, and what happens to neurological function, psychological function, the progression to death, because if untreated, eventually we'll die. That's just how it is. Fun fact, in 1947, penicillin became available as a treatment for syphilis, and these men were not given that treatment. At this point, the people behind this experiment could have changed the experimental design to include penicillin, But they didn't. They chose to stay the course, see what happens, and get as much data as they could over almost 40 years. Participants in this experiment all received a placebo. So, if you're not familiar with the term, a placebo is basically, in this case, like a sugar pill or a saline shot. It's not an actual treatment that will help things. It's something that's given usually as a control to see if people improving is from an actual drug or procedure or whatever, and not just because they're getting treated. So again, all the men in this experiment, some of whom had syphilis, did not receive an available treatment. All of them were given a placebo. Over the course of this experiment, many of the men did die from syphilis, and their wives were infected, kids were born infected. There was a huge body count for this experiment, and not just people who died, but the suffering inflicted on those, because they didn't realize that they were being duped, basically, by the people that they were trusting to help them. This experiment only ended when the experiment details were leaked to the press, and a huge amount of outrage happened. This experiment and a couple others led to the establishment of institutional review boards. And again, I'll talk about exactly what those are later, but we needed to have some body, organization, committee, something overseeing these experiments that were going on, because apparently not all the doctors can be trusted. Now let's move into some of the more questionable psychology experiments that we really need to talk about when we're talking about ethics.
Would you shock a man if someone in a lab coat told you to do so? Would you continue to shock this man if you knew it might possibly kill him?
The first experiment we're going to talk about is the Milgram experiment from 1963. For the Milgram experiment, they posted an advertisement in the local newspaper. Basically, it was a public announcement paying people $4 for an hour of their time. Men were recruited, and they were taking everybody from factory workers, laborers, up to more white-collar-ish jobs like salespeople and other office-y, engineer-y, whatever jobs. And they wanted people between 20 and 50, but they did require that you not have some form of higher education. If somebody wanted to participate in this, they needed to contact Stanley Milgram at Yale University, and they would be scheduled and... All right. So the procedure of this experiment. Participant would arrive, and they're seated next to a Confederate. The Confederate was always the same guy, and they sit and they wait for the experiment to begin. In the intake, both people are told, so the participant and the Confederate are told that this is an experiment about learning. One person's going to be the teacher, the other person is going to be the learner. They are told from the experimenter who's wearing the stereotypical white lab coat that selection of roles will be random. So that means that whoever's going to be learner, whoever's going to be teacher, that assignment's random, but in reality it's not. The actual participant was always assigned the role of teacher, and the Confederate was always assigned the role of learner. So they get back, roles are assigned, the participant, the teacher, is invited back to watch the learner be hooked up to the electrodes. During this, the learner mentions that he's got a heart issue, and that, will this be an issue during the experiment? And he is assured by the experimenter, no, it'll be fine. These shocks won't be an issue with your heart problem. The teacher runs through the experiment and is told to shock the learner when they're wrong, and they're learning a series of words. The important part here is, as the process is going on, each time the teacher shocks the learner, he has to step up the voltage of the shock. So every time he makes a mistake, the shock gets worse, incrementally.
Cloud, horse, rock, house. Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer, horse.
Experiment, that's all. Get me out of here.
And as the experiment goes on, the learner starts apparently voicing discomfort at the shocks that he's receiving. If the participant, the teacher, is hesitating or looking to the experimenter like, what do I do? This guy is not okay. He is encouraged to continue. It is imperative that the experiment go on.
Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
He refuses to go on.
The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
You're gonna get a shock. 180 volts.
Ow! I can't stand the pain. Let me out of
Can't
here.
stand it. I'm not gonna kill that man there. I mean, who's gonna take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
All right, next one. Slow. Walk, dance, truck, music.
As the experiment continues, at some point, the learner apparently stops responding. He stops screaming. He stops pushing the little answer buttons. He's not responding. And the experimenter tells the teacher, you must continue. It is imperative that we go on with this experiment. Continue to administer shocks.
375 volts. I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering with less voltage. Can't you check in to see if he's all right, please?
In the original versions of this experiment, 65% of participants administered the highest value of shock. After the experiment was over, there was a comprehensive debriefing. The participants were told the nature of the experiment. They were taken back, shown the guy's okay, he's fine. It was actually a record playing after a certain point. We had it all wired, so the responses were happening automatically. You know, you didn't hurt the guy. It's okay. We were interested to see how far people would follow authority and if they would hurt another person if somebody told them to do so. I'll also mention that in the course of the experiment, no teacher insisted the experiment end. They all continued. Also, no teacher insisted that they check on the learner. They were all persuaded by the experimenter to keep going. It's fine. Leave him back there. It's fine. Did participants in this experiment have informed consent? Did they know what they were signing up for? In class, I would have a discussion about this, but let's have something here together. As far as we know, at that point in history, we didn't know what people would do if they were in this circumstance. We don't know how much mental duress they would have been put under being in these conditions. So you could make the argument that, given the state of understanding and knowledge at the time, they were given adequate informed consent. Also, the use of deception was needed, because if they knew that that guy wasn't really in harm, it'd be like playing a video game. Nobody's getting hurt. Go all the way. Let's start at the maximum shock setting, whatever. It's funny. How about experimental safeguards? Was it okay for the experimenter, frequently Milgram, to push participants to continue even when they looked uncomfortable? Is the knowledge that we gain from this, that people will obey authority under certain circumstances and harm other people, is it worth the discomfort, duress, and possible trauma that these people experienced in the course of this experiment? They found out something dark about their nature that day, that if somebody who is an authority figure tells you to do something, they'll do it. Is that something that you'd want to live with the rest of your life? Another question we can ask is if this experiment was appropriate. So this took place in the 60s, and this, I think, in part came out of interest from World War II and the trials that took place in Nuremberg for the Nazis. A lot of Nazis and former Nazi party members were saying that they were just following directions. They were doing what they were told. Was that a valid defense? Did they have the means to object to this? And so this experiment was trying to get at that. If good people will follow bad directions. Was this the best way to do it? Hard to say.
Tell me, Miss Kitty, would you take advantage of prisoners under your care if the warden told you to do so?
The next experiment I'm going to talk about is the Zimbardo Prison Study Experiment. This experiment took place in 1971, and I'll include a video link in the description. Hopefully the video is still online. If not, I'll make something happen. In this experiment, Zimbardo was testing the source of prison guard abuse. It was a huge problem in the late 60s, early 70s that guards were beating the crap out of prisoners. And so there were riots, and because people don't like being beaten up, especially by somebody who has all the authority over you. Zimbardo's theory was that there was some inherent trait difference between prisoners and guards that was leading to the guards beating the crap out of the prisoners. This experiment recruited 24 normal, happy, healthy, white male participants who were attending Stanford. So Stanford is a little bit of a special population, but could be said to be fairly representative of white men of that age range to some extent. These men had no history of psychological trauma, emotional trauma, physical impairments. These were happy, healthy individuals going into the experiment. The prison was set up in the basement of the psych building at Stanford. This experiment was scheduled to last 2 weeks, where the guards would rotate through on shifts and the prisoners would be there 24/7. To say that the situation deteriorated rapidly would be a huge understatement. Setup details for this experiment. The prison was designed to induce disorientation with the surroundings, depersonalization, de-individualization of the prisoners. They had their clothes removed. They were given special prison garb. The guards also had special attire. They had wooden batons. They were given a uniform that looked kind of prison-y, and they were even given the stupid mirrored Ray-Bans so that they fully looked the part. Guards were oriented the day before the experiment started so that they knew what to do, what was expected of them, and they were told not to physically harm the participants. The prisoners were arrested from their homes by police, taken in the back of the cop car to the Stanford prison, where they would spend the next 2 weeks, in theory. They were given the full experience. They had mugshots taken. They were fingerprinted. They were trying to make this experience as authentic as they could, short of any of the number of things going on in prisons these days. Once they were in the prison, the prisoners were only referred to by their inmate number. They no longer had names, which can be somewhat true for prisons these days. They were given uncomfortable smocks. The participants that were prisoners were held 3 to a cell, which is kind of cramped because these were small rooms. And originally they had beds to sleep on. As I mentioned, the prisoners had to stay 24 hours a day as prisoners, whereas the guards worked in shifts. So they were able to go have dinner, go home, have a normal life other than being guards part-time. Day 2, one cell revolted and barricaded their door. In response to this, the guards thought it would be best to contain the situation with the fire extinguisher. So they were able to get into the room and get the barricade down and diffuse that situation somewhat. Days 3 and 4, the situation really started to take a turn. Prisoner number 8612 had a full-on breakdown.
I feel so up inside. I feel really up inside. You don't know. I gotta go. To a doctor, anything. I can't stay in there. I'm up. I don't know how to explain it. I'm all up inside. Help me out! Help me now! God damn it. I'm up. You don't know. I mean, God. I mean, Jesus Christ, I'm burning up inside. Don't you know? I just can't take it.
Zimbardo has been quoted as saying, "It took quite a while before we became convinced that he was really suffering and that we had to release him." This prisoner was under a great amount of stress. They had it. They were screaming. They wanted to go home. They wanted out of the experiment. Out. Remember when we were talking about ethics and informed consent and part of your rights as a participant? He was denied that for some period of time. He wanted to quit, and they wouldn't let him. He had to be convincing enough, and Zimbardo had to remember, oh yeah, this is an experiment. before he was allowed to leave. Day 5, they had a replacement prisoner for the one who left.
Yeah, when we released the first prisoner, 8612, we brought in a substitute, but he came in halfway through. And what's interesting is, day by day, as the situation degraded, we all adjusted to it. That is, each day's level of violence, of abuse, was a platform for the next day. But he comes in now, and he's seeing these crazy things going on. He says right up front, I'm not having any of this. And they told him, you can't leave. They won't let you leave.
And he went on a hunger strike and was put in a dark closet as punishment.
And so he says, I'm going to go on a hunger strike. I'm not going to eat anything. I'll get sick, and they'll have to let me go. And he's a skinny kid to begin with. And the guards go crazy because he's now the symbol of resistance. All the other kids are broken. If they're not having emotional breakdowns, they're like zombies. They're doing whatever the guard said. And for the next 2 days, every guard on every shift, their mission is get this prisoner to eat those damn sausages. They put him in solitary confinement. They make him hold the sausages. And to his credit, he resists.
Also on day 5, prisoners were given lots of exercise as punishment. Doing jumping jacks, push-ups, jumping jacks, push-ups, over and over and over again, well past the point where their body was done as a form of punishment by the guards. At this point, the prisoners were forced to urinate and defecate in buckets in their cells. They lost bathroom privileges, and they were not allowed to empty them as punishment. So as the days go on, or as the day goes on, it gets worse. The smell gets worse. It becomes more of a hazard of knocking it over. It's a very gross and human rights violation-y thing to do to prisoners, and especially to participants in an experiment in the basement of one of the world's most famous universities. Like, come on. The prisoners were revolting somewhat, and so they removed their mattresses as punishment. The prisoners continued to be unruly, so the guards removed their clothes as punishment. And this is the point at which the replacement prisoner goes on strike, because this is ridiculous. Finally, on day 6, the experiment is terminated. Finally, because it is just a huge mess and out of control, and it's kind of gross that it was allowed to get that far. Now here's the fun thing. Zimbardo's grad student / then girlfriend, I think current wife, is the one who convinced him that this was not okay. She was brought in to interview the prisoners and was just like, this is ridiculous and disgusting. What is wrong with you? Stop this now. It's not uncommon for professors to be dating grad students or undergrads, unfortunately. I am kind of planning on talking about that as a separate video, because there was a lot of that going around in my program. But yeah, it's a fun little detail, but it's not uncommon. So before going into some things that have come out more recently on the Zimbardo prison experiment, let's go through the same questions that we did for the Milgram experiment. Was informed consent given? You can make the case that people hadn't been in this sort of situation before, and it wasn't clear that the situation would develop to the point that it did. They were told as prisoners that they'd be brought in and held for 24 hours and treated as prisoners, and that they wouldn't be harmed physically. But was it necessarily clear to them, to anyone, that the situation would have developed like it did? Were experimental safeguards in place? No. And we'll get to this in the controversy part, but Zimbardo has admitted that he basically took on the role of prison warden and was enjoying it. He is the one who is supposed to be monitoring this and ready to pull the plug when it gets crazy. He didn't. So, the experimental safeguards were not in place here. Was this experiment appropriate? Again, you can make the case that we needed to understand some of the dynamics at play in the prison guard situation, and arguably we did learn something from this, potentially, again, controversy, that people in a position of power will abuse that power, especially if people above them aren't keeping them in check. So it's not some trait that prisoners are weak-willed or deserve to be beaten or anything like that. It's a situational thing with power coming in and screwing things up. Was this experiment necessary? 24 men went through this process, and some of them were arguably traumatized by it.
I began to feel that I was losing my identity, that the person that I call Clay, the person who put me in this place, the person who volunteered to go into this prison, because it was a prison to me, it still is a prison to me. I don't look on it as an experiment or a simulation. It was just a prison that was run by psychologists instead of run by the state.
It was an awful thing for them to endure, especially as prisoners, but also the guards. They learned sort of the darker parts of their nature when allowed to turn loose, what they could do to a fellow human.
I had really thought that I was incapable of this kind of behavior. I was surprised, even no, I was dismayed to find out that I could really be that I could act in a manner so absolutely unaccustomed to anything I would even really dream of doing. And while I was doing it, I didn't feel any regret. I didn't feel any guilt. It was only afterwards, when I began to reflect on what I had done, that this behavior began to dawn on me, and I realized that this was a part of me I hadn't really noticed before.
And that's something that they have to carry with them the rest of their life. So there is a cost to this. However, it is important for us to keep in mind, in today's society even, that prisoners are still human beings. They may have done crimes, some less severe than others, but they're still humans, and they deserve the basic dignities of being human. Access to bathroom, some privacy, not being beaten like a dog. You know, these sorts of things are really important for people, and if the guards lose sight of them as being humans, it's more likely for this sort of abuse to happen.
And no one questioned my authority at all. And it really shocked me. Why didn't people, when I started to get abuse people so much, I started to get so profane that, and still people didn't say anything.
The controversy for the prison experiment. One issue is that it hasn't ever been replicated successfully. A huge part of science, and I'll talk about this in a separate video, a huge part of science is replicability. We need to be able to reproduce an experiment's results, methods, everything, in order to verify that this is something real and not just a one-off fluke. The prison experiment has not been replicated. One critique of this experiment is that it wasn't really scientifically rigorous. There weren't great controls in place, if any. The experimental design wasn't the best. And in response to this, Zimbardo has been quoted as saying, "From the beginning, I've always said it's a demonstration. The only thing that makes an experiment is the random assignment to prisoners and guards. That's the independent variable. There is no control group. There's no comparison group. So it doesn't fit the standards of what it means to be an experiment. It's a very powerful demonstration of a psychological phenomenon, and it has had relevance." Another point of contention for this experiment is the treatment of the prisoners by the guards. Some of the guards were deemed to have displayed sadistic traits in their treatment of the prisoners under their care, and that's not good.
It harms me.
Why?
I mean harms. I mean in the present tense, it harms me.
How did it harm you? How does it harm you? Just to think about it, you mean that people can be like that?
Yeah. It let me in on some knowledge that I've never experienced firsthand. I've read about it. I've read a lot about it. But I've never experienced it firsthand. I've never seen someone turn that way. And I know you're a nice guy. You know?
You
Do you understand? I do. I do know you're a nice guy.
Then why,
I don't
you hate
get bad because I know what you can turn into.
Were they screened appropriately? Were they coached? Like, what's going on here? So to Zimbardo, it was just that everybody was deeply absorbed into their roles as prisoner guard, and that's why the experiment went the way it did.
You put a uniform on and are given a role, a job, saying your job is to keep these people in line, then you're certainly not the same person as if you were in street clothes and in a different role. You really become that person once you put on that khaki uniform, you put on the glasses, you take the nightstick, and you act the part. That's your costume, and you have to act accordingly when you put it on.
It's not that maybe some of the guards or prisoners had some pre-existing trait, condition, whatever, that led them to be particularly damaged, either as a prisoner or be particularly nasty as a guard. To really hammer home how horribly the participants that were prisoners were treated, there's a website for the Stanford Prison experiment, and this quote describes the treatment that those people went under. Each prisoner was systematically searched and stripped naked. He was then deloused with a spray to convey our belief that he may have germs or lice. Real male prisoners don't wear dresses, but real male prisoners do feel humiliated and do feel emasculated. Our goal was to produce similar effects quickly by putting men in a dress without any underclothes. Just an aside, that's the smock I was talking about. Indeed, as soon as some of our prisoners were put in these uniforms, they began to walk and to sit differently and to hold themselves differently, more like a woman than a man. Another issue with this experiment in the replicability of it is a strong reliance on anecdotal evidence. Because there weren't great controls in place in this experiment, a lot of what we know about what happened is basically just talking about what happened and not being able to really pin things down. And that's really a problem for trying to replicate this when we don't know what exactly led to the outcomes that they had. Another critique of the experiment is that the guards were coached. A man by the name of Carlos Prescott, who was a prison guard and an advisor on this experiment, recently came out and said this: "Ideas such as bags being placed over the heads of prisoners, inmates being bound together with chains and buckets being used in place of toilets in their cells, were all experiences of mine at the old Spanish jail section of San Quentin, and which I dutifully shared with the Stanford Prison experiment, brain trust months before the experiment started. To allege that all these carefully tested, psychologically solid, upper-middle-class Caucasian guards dreamed this up on their own is absurd. How can Zimbardo express horror at the behavior of the guards when they were merely doing what Zimbardo and others, myself included, encouraged them to do at the outset or frankly established as ground rules?" Part of why this is an issue is because Zimbardo and Prescott have become experts in prison reform, what needs to happen to keep prisoners safer and prison guards safer even too. And this experiment is a huge part of Zimbardo's street cred for why he should have an impact on deciding what should happen. And this is kind of being called into question. Another problem with the guard coaching is that video recently, like last year, surfaced of people, the guards in the experiment, sort of coaching each other on how to be tougher prison guards and to act tough and to be tough, and you need to be more on these guys' case. We need to break them almost. And this goes against the idea that this sort of developed naturally. If these guys were being coached to be nasty, that throws all of the outcomes of this experiment into question. Another issue for this experiment are the demand characteristics. Demand characteristics are something that we try to reduce when we're designing an experiment. It's basically the experimenter thrusting what they want the experiment to have happen onto the experiment, either by nodding along when somebody's getting something right, when they shouldn't be getting that feedback. It could be treating certain participants nicer when they're in a condition where you want them to be happier, or to have a happy outcome. There's subtle ways that we can influence participants, which we shouldn't really be doing unless that's the point of the experiment itself. And it's been put out there that Zimbardo wasn't idly sitting by letting this experiment happen. He was actively involved. We know he was actively involved. He saw himself as the prison warden. And because of this, he was sort of forcing a narrative onto how this experiment should go down instead of letting it develop naturally, as would have, we thought, been the case. As promised, where are we today? Today, we have institutional review boards. As I mentioned, these can also be called ethical review boards or any other number of things. The point of these is to safeguard the experiments and the participants in these experiments. At a major university, there may be several IRBs or just one that handles the whole university. At the place I went, the IRB handled both human participants and animal participants. All university level and community level even research must be submitted to an IRB for approval. If you are in high school doing a science project and wanting to do something with people, you need to go through this process to make sure you're not going to accidentally harm people. Or if you're doing it with animals even, you need to submit this for the local university to approve it. Chances are it'll get through with no problem, but this is still something that needs to happen if you're going to do an experiment on living things, really. Plants are kind of excluded. Never had to do it for ecology. Poor plants. For research to be published anywhere, it needs to have the IRB's approval. And there's been universities over the course of basically IRB's existence that have sidestepped the IRBs, or the IRB itself was found to be at fault. And if that happens, that institution loses the right to funding, to research, to everything for some set period of time. It can be a couple years punishment, it can be 10 years. People need to go through this process honestly and with integrity because there are huge ramifications for their employer if this doesn't happen. And when I say they lose grants, that is a huge source of funding for most universities, especially research tier. If they lose their grants because somebody over in psychology or biology couldn't be bothered to do their job right, there is going to be a huge amount of fallout because they lost their funding. They may have lost postdocs, they lost grad students, they lost research for a huge chunk of their career. That's a problem. My experience with ethics and participants and everything, I sort of shared participants getting sick in the driving simulator. For the most part, my experiments weren't too taxing or weird. I did have one experiment I found out years later that was too hard and had students questioning if they should be in college and made one of my later research assistants cry. Whoops. The informed consent. I told them what they'd be doing. To some extent, it was another implicit learning thing, so they didn't know that there was repeating information. But I didn't think it was going to be that hard, and I'm terribly sorry that it caused angst for some of the participants that went through it. A more severe example was from one of the faculty members in my program. He was doing an experiment on memory, and it's common in memory experiments to have a distractor task in between. So you do a bunch of learning memory stuff, recall states, do some math problems, do something to clear your head as the distractor task for a minute, couple minutes, and then go back to the memory task. This one participant apparently wasn't good at math, and this was just a worksheet of 2-digit math problems, so 47 plus 26, 73 plus 39, just a sheet of that. Partway through the experiment, she breaks down. She is inconsolable. She is just losing it. She's having a breakdown in the course of this experiment. The researcher or research assistant who is there running her is thankfully a very kind person, comes over, "What's wrong? What happened?" And apparently this participant took having some difficulty with the math problems to mean that she was not fit to be in college. I don't know if she was having problems in her classes. I don't know if just she was freezing up because this was in the middle of the experiment and she thought she was going to be judged on this. I don't know why this struck a nerve for her. Thankfully, the researcher, again, very kind, very empathetic, very thoughtful, told her, like, okay, we're stopping, you're done. And then spent the rest of the study session making her feel okay about herself. Just because you're having trouble with this doesn't mean you don't belong in college. It's okay. Everybody has a bad day. If you're having trouble, there's different offices you can speak to. What sort of trouble are you having? You know, it was this huge thing. And how do you predict that somebody's just going to have such a bad response to something that we feel is benign as just a distractor task? It's a thing you have to consider. This has been a crash course in ethics for psychology, although it also kind of covers why biology ethics situation is what it is currently. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments or on Twitter. And yeah, see you in the next video. Bye.
Confess. You're feeling? Good talk.